Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody. To those of you who are here for the first time and those of you who've been here for the last few lectures. So as part of the Year of History, Heritage and Archaeology 2017, Historic Environment Scotland are presenting a series of lectures to tell Scotland's story from the deepest past through to the present day. The purpose of this series is to share and celebrate the wealth and knowledge of our organisation and to give people a chance to learn about the archaeology and history of Scotland. Our speakers will provide you with an introduction to the period, an insight into the work which ignites their passion for their subject area, and also give you a little bit of a flavour of the sort of work that Historic Environment Scotland undertakes, which relates to this particular period. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Rebecca Jones, and she is going to focus on Roman Scotland, specifically looking at the mid-2nd century when Antonius Pius attempted to conquer Scotland. As many of you will know and may have seen in the press recently, the 18th of April was World Heritage Day, and the Antonine Wall is one of Scotland's 6 World Heritage sites. So this is a very well-timed lecture. So Dr. Rebecca Jones is Head of Archaeology and World Heritage at Historic Environment Scotland, which is the team that I work in. And her academic interests focus on the Roman army and Roman frontiers, particularly in Scotland, but also wider afield. She is co-chair of the International Congress of Roman Frontier Studies, and led the team in undertaking the mapping of the Antonine Wall in Scotland, and was part of the successful nomination for the Antonine Wall as a World Heritage Site. So she's recently published monographs on Roman camps and won Current Archaeology's Book of the Year in 2013, and she's an acknowledged worldwide expert on Roman camps. And you can see her pulling her face because I'm really bigging her up here, because I should also mention that Rebecca is also my line manager. So just so that you're aware, this evening's lecture will be on YouTube eventually when we've got it all nicely tarted up. And we'll also be going out via Facebook Live, because we did the last lecture via Facebook Live and just fantastic success. We reached thousands of people by doing it that way, because as you'll already have figured out, we have limited tickets for this venue. We can only fit about 50 people into this room, so it's really great that we've got this opportunity. So hello to all our Facebook Live viewers as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Jones.
Thank you very much. Well, as Kirsty said, one of our roles is to provide you with an introduction to the period, and as you could tell from the title and possibly from aspects of music you may have heard at various stages, I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan as well. So I'm afraid the introduction and the history will be fairly irreverent. Sorry, this is my nerves because I'm being streamed live. So I thought I would start off with a little bit of background to the history of the Romans in Britain. For copyright reasons, we can't be playing any tunes in here, so you can just imagine them in your mind as you're doing this. For those of you that are aware that there were a couple of expeditions by Julius Caesar in the 50s BC, coming into southern Britain, and where he actually came to is still the subject of debate. But then after that, there was quite a hiatus with other activities going on until we very slowly got the full-blown attack of the Romans in AD 43. And this actually saw a series of troops arriving in southeast England and then gradually spreading across the rest of Britain from the southeast with various successes and resistance along the way. Now in AD 60 they were up in Wales desecrating the sacred groves up on Anglesey when Boudicca revolted. So we got the Boudiccan revolt in AD 60. And one of the things that's been quite interesting in looking at the archaeology across Britain, and certainly our knowledge of the historical sources as well, and I'll come back to both of those later, is actually the resistance of the Welsh tribes, which was actually quite a strong feature and bore, I think, a certain level of similarities to what they started to encounter when they came further north. Some areas of Britain were far more receptive to Roman rule than others. So this is when you're going to be really glad there's only 7 films, is all I can say. Now in AD 68-69 is known as the Year of 4 Emperors. After the suicide of the Emperor Nero, we had 4 emperors in very quick succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then latterly Vespasian. And I'll be talking a bit more about Vespasian later on in the lecture, because he is critical from a Scottish perspective. This one's obviously the title of this lecture. So I have taken a little bit of artistic license with my language here. In the previous one, we have no knowledge that the rebels stole the plans to a legionary fortress, but it fitted kind of with the Death Star kind of relation. I was trying to work out what was closer to the Death Star from a Roman perspective. But actually Vespasian had previously been in Britain, and so he had an interest in the country, and he dispatched Agricola up into the north, and certainly we're aware of activities in northern Britain and up into Scotland, and we're quite fortunate with Agricola that his daughter married the Roman writer Tacitus. So we have a wonderful biography of him. The downside is it's rather skewed the way we look at the archaeology. We know that Agricola had a set-piece battle with the Caledonians. We don't know how big it was. Well, we've got what the sources tell us how big it was, but there may have been a little bit of massaging of the facts at a place called Mons Graupius, which has still not been found. But the Emperor Domitian then had to recall a legion from Britain, and Scotland was temporarily abandoned. So if I can now move off and then move on to the meat of the lecture. So sorry, that was a slightly irreverent introduction to Roman Scotland, or to Roman Britain. But in terms of what our knowledge is, and I'll start off with the historical sources and then move on to the archaeology. We start off with, we know that the Romans were in southern Scotland. We can't pinpoint the exact date. We've got tantalising pieces of evidence from various sites. But they were in southern Scotland, certainly by the 70s AD. I've mentioned Agricola, who was governor of Britain from 77 to 83, which is quite a long tenure. You'll see different people agreeing with the actual dates, but that's the fairly standard dates. We've got this Battle of Mons Graupius, and then, as I say, a gradual pulling back from Scotland and an abandonment by the 90s. Then into the 2nd century, obviously Hadrian's Wall was a major feature. When the Emperor Hadrian came in, he basically drew a ring round the empire. But after his death, his successor, Antoninus Pius, the reasons for this are debated, but one of which being that he probably needed a victory in order to cement his position as emperor, and it may be that Scotland had been a bit troublesome. So at that point, they moved north and in effect abandoned the Hadrian's Wall and built a new wall, the Antonine Wall, which I'll talk a bit more about later. That was only held for about a generation. There was a retreat south in the 160s, and Hadrian's Wall then became the frontier again. And then we've got tantalising hints in literary sources of campaigns in the north by Ulpius Marcellus, a buy-off of local tribes in the north, and we have got some archaeological evidence for that. And then the Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century came back into Scotland. He brought his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, who were basically being seen possibly as being a bit lazy. He wanted to get them away from the luxuries of Rome and actually come up here. And he had, I think, when you start reading the literary sources, what can only be described in modern terms as genocidal tendencies towards Scotland. But he died in York in February 211, and his sons felt that Rome was a bigger prize than Scotland, and so it wasn't then subsequently held with any longevity. And then we get campaigns against the Picts reference, and trouble with the Picts and Pictish wars, almost like it's becoming a stock phrase in some of the literature. And then obviously the abandonment of Roman Britain in the early 5th century. But then moving on to what archaeology can tell us. Well, in terms of what we know, we've got a number of sites that survive really well as upstanding earthwork remains, and a number of them are actually, one or two are in the care of Historic Environment Scotland and can be visited. We've got quite a large number that we've only known from aerial survey, so they've only really been discovered from the mid-20th century onwards. More recently, we've got geophysical survey telling us more, and in some instances finding new sites. Excavation, we're still finding new sites on occasion through excavation and other remote sensing techniques. We're extremely fortunate in that there's been a very, very long history of research. So starting off with Roy's military survey in the 18th century, actually William Roy was very, very interested in the remains of the Roman army and recorded and mapped a huge number of them. And for those of you not familiar with William Roy, he's generally regarded as the founding father of the Ordnance Survey. So we've got somebody who's very interested in Roman remains and interested in mapping. And quite a number of the sites that he recorded have since been lost as earthworks to the plough and only now recorded from the air. So that's very beneficial. We've got the research of antiquarians, and this is the very first Roman fort excavation in Scotland in the late 19th century by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland at the request of the Dumfries and Galloway Society. Aerial survey, the very first survey in Scotland was done by O.G.S. Crawford in 1930, and he was the archaeological officer for the Ordnance Survey, and he was another person with very strong interests in Roman archaeology. And what he did was then, his effective successor in aerial survey in Britain was Kenneth St Joseph at Cambridge University, another Romanist. So he had a lot of flights in Scotland from 1946 onwards. And then in 1976, one of the predecessor bodies to Historic Environment Scotland set up its own recording programme, and that was led by Gordon Maxwell, another Romanist. So in terms of our aerial record, a huge amount has been recorded by Romanists. So we've actually got a certain bias in it, but it's a bias that's of benefit to those of us who are studying Roman archaeology. And as I say, more recently, we've got techniques of remote sensing like this multi-sensor array geophysics, LiDAR data, that's rough castle on the Antonine Wall, and excavations are usually a bit bigger than this, but that's one of the ones from the 1960s. Now, I thought I'd explain a little bit about some of the terms I'll be using today. Apologies for those of you that know all of these. In terms of a hierarchy, so in effect, the most substantial bases that the Romans built were their legionary fortresses, and these can be quite huge in size, 20 hectares or more. And these were the big headquartered bases across Britain, and one was built in Scotland in the 1st century at Inchtothil, and this is it here. We've then got vexillation fortresses, which are a little trickier to actually identify with any confidence, but they essentially hold mixed fortresses, and they're usually quite big, and this is the Cropmark of one down in southwest Scotland. And then we've got Roman forts, which are in many ways the backbone of Roman army accommodation, and these are the garrison posts that we find in quite a lot of places across northern Britain, because anywhere where you need a strong military presence, you need to house the soldiers. Then we have smaller ones in terms of fortlets, and these would have hold smaller units, and you quite often get them in networks in areas which are perhaps not that secure, and then actually you get them on frontier fortifications. So on Hadrians Wall you get these every mile, so they're known as mile castles, and we've got a number of them on the Antonine Wall as well. Towers, I say these are usually freestanding, although obviously in the case of this one, this is one of the reconstructions in southern Germany, which would have been attached to the wall, the linear barrier there. And then we have camps, which, as Kirsty's already mentioned, is my particular specialist area. And these were the temporary housing structures for soldiers. And in Scotland, most of the ones that we've got we can identify as being soldiers on the march. So it's troops who are away, mostly on campaigning, probably only occupied for a few nights or weeks at best. So the archaeological evidence they leave is not a massive amount, because as you can imagine, a bunch of people camped in a space for a week is not going to leave the same amount of material left to be found nearly 2 millennia later by archaeologists than a garrison stationed in a fort for 20 years. But we have got some, I always like these literary references. Vegetius writing in the late Roman period, basically referring to a camp as a walled city that they carry around with them. And then we've got one from Josephus, who was a contemporary of the Jewish war in the 1st century AD, talking about refusing battle till they fortified their camp, having the engineers with them. But interestingly, he wrote that they fire the camp, which they can easily reconstruct if required, lest it might someday be useful to the enemy. Well, given the amount that have actually survived in the landscape, they can't have fired all of them. And obviously they're built with different materials. The materials they used to build them in the Near East is very different to what they had at their disposal in Scotland. So moving on, I've mentioned that's Vespasian. And this is when you hear reference to the Flavian period. These are the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his son Titus and Domitian. Now Vespasian ordered the conquest of Scotland, and that was continued by his sons. He died in AD 79. He was succeeded by Titus, who died in 81, only a couple of years later. And then Domitian was the next emperor. And Domitian has not been regarded well by the literary sources, I think it's fair to say. I think he was damned and assassinated indeed. I mean, one of the things that you learn with Roman emperors is actually if you want to live a long life, being a Roman emperor is probably not the way to go about it. Now, in terms of the archaeology that's been left from this period, as I've mentioned, the fortress at Inchtuthil up in Perthshire, which I hope you can see there on the Cropmarks. But also we've got some very well dated sites, like this is the fort at Elginhoch, which is near Dalkeith. And we've got foundation deposits and dating evidence in terms of coins and various aspects that suggests that this was constructed really and occupied in quite a tight time scale from about 77 to about 86 AD, so quite a small time frame. And that had a huge amount of excavations, which was funded by Historic Environment Scotland's predecessor back in the 70s. And that's told us a huge amount about the Roman army in the 1st century. And then bringing us right up to date to a site at Bladnoch, which is near Wigton, which was only discovered through aerial photographs about 6 years ago. And I don't know if you can see a very subtle feature here. This is Tessa Poller from Glasgow University, who undertook geophysical survey. And we've got a very nice fortlet there, which there's been no excavation work done on it, but comparisons with others and what we know about the area, we think that was probably 1st century as well. I want to also mention the fact that we have got references to sailors and the fleet, but obviously finding evidence for that is very, very difficult. But we've got these wonderful references. As I say, Tacitus wrote a biography of his father-in-law, Agricola, and he makes references to the Roman fleet sailing around Britain. And then it depends on how you translate the Latin, but I love the idea of infantry, cavalry and marines mingling and joyously sharing the same meals and basically boasting about their achievements. And you can imagine the kind of camaraderie that you may have got in some of these things, just sort of in tantalising hints. Other 1st century sites, this is one that was surveyed by Historic Environment Scotland surveyors about a decade ago at Ravenfoot in Esdalemuir. And every time I go to Esdalemuir, it's always sunny. I gather it's got the highest precipitation in Scotland, but it's always nice when I go there. And we've got particular gateways on this particular camp, which are only used, we believe, in Britain in the 1st century AD. So although, again, we've got lots of sites, because we've got huge numbers of sites, you can't excavate everything, and indeed nor would you necessarily wish to, because you need to leave things for subsequent generations. But what we can do is try and find out as much as we can through non-invasive methods. In this case, this was actually doing a topographic survey, but obviously geophysical survey is another way of finding things out. And you can see how subtle the earthwork is here. So we believe that's a 1st century camp. And it's, to a certain extent, there's an aspect, I've moved on too many. There's an element of jigsaw going on with some of these in terms of trying to put things together. And this is another site that's had partial excavation at Dalswinton down in Dumfriesshire. And it's one of these fort sites up here with another fort of some description down here and surrounded by a number of camps. And you tend to find the Romans obviously had itineraries of some sort, and they go back time and time again to the same sites. So quite a number of these sites you see occupied in the 1st century and indeed in the 2nd century in the subsequent conquest, which of course was some 60 years later. So what that actually tells us, and it's all that evidence combined that then actually gives us, enables us to produce maps like these. And this one here is forts and fortlets that we believe to date to the 1st century. And here is one of the camps that we currently think are 1st century in date. Some we've got very strong dating for, and others are more by analogy, looking at the gates and that side of things. I wanted to mention also, before I leave the 1st century, the Gask Ridge. And I don't know if any of you have ever visited the Gask Ridge, but a couple of the sites are actually in properties in care in Historic Environment Scotland, so you can actually they've got good display boards and they're nicely laid out. You have to do a wee walk along a track to get to them, but they're well worth a visit. And this one is Muirfold, And if there's 4 of you, it's always worth standing and trying to be a watchtower. Because essentially you've got 4 wooden posts. This is the Cropmark of one. Unfortunately, you can't see the post too well, but you had these things, and they would have had these timber towers going up, and they're watching the road that runs across along the gas bridge between, in effect, from Doon up through to Perth. I've said, obviously, a legion was pulled out of Britain by Domitian because of he had other battles to fight. And so there's a gradual withdrawal. The northern conquests of Scotland are given up. The fortress at Inchtoothill is abandoned. And there's a gradual pulling back. And then Domitian's successor is the Emperor Trajan. Now, Trajan is obviously very famous for the column in Rome, but this actually depicts his campaigns in Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. And so his focus was elsewhere, and it was only after his death that Hadrian, his successor, who had very much a desire to limit the empire and draw a ring round it, and that's when we saw the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Now, Hadrian's Wall has had a huge amount of... everyone knows about Hadrian's Wall, so I'm not going to talk about that. But what I want to point out in relation to Hadrian's Wall is there's the wall itself, but you will see quite a network of forts going down. You don't just stick a line of forts along a frontier. You need that garrison in depth to support that. And that's also then reflected when we move on to the into the Antonine period. So Hadrian's successor was Antoninus Pius, and I've already mentioned whether he was looking for a quick victory, but he ordered Lollius Urbicus, who was the governor, was sent to Scotland. And the most notable remnant that we have from that is the Antonine Wall. Now, there's been quite a lot of work recently at a site called Burnswalk down in Dumfriesshire, and the current research that they're doing, when it comes up, by the Tremontium Trust and Dumfries and Galloway Council, is they are undertaking targeted metal detecting and excavation to try and identify dating evidence and try and work out whether this is a genuine siege or not. Now, not everybody is convinced, but the evidence that they are gathering now is starting to point to it being the site of a genuine siege, and they are starting to narrow down the dating as potentially the early Antonine period. So at the moment they're speculating, which is why I've put various question marks on there, but speculating that actually this was undertaken by Lollius Urbicus when he first came to Scotland. It's probably a bit overkill, in fairness, but there's a huge amount of ballista bolts and various missiles that have now been located from the hill, and at the moment they're doing a lot of work on the metals to try and establish the source as well as the date. But then that brings me on to the Antonine Wall. Now, the construction of the Antonine Wall started in roughly 142 AD. And as I've mentioned, it was occupied for a generation, and it runs from Old Kilpatrick on the north side of the Clyde across central Scotland to the south side of the Forth. And we've got the terminus fort at Caradon. We don't know exactly where it runs in its eastern location, but we do know where it runs for most of its length, and in parts of it survives incredibly well, which is quite remarkable given how densely populated this part of Scotland is. One of the sites that you can visit is the Bathhouse at Bearsden, where a series of excavations were done in the 70s and 80s as a result of various development changes going on by David Breeze, who's delighted in the audience tonight. The Bathhouse is one of our properties in care and can be visited. And it's always nice to show people enjoying themselves, even if they're not quite Roman helmets. And this is Rough Castle on the Antonine Wall, and I don't know how many of you have been to the Antonine Wall, but I do encourage visiting it, because this is when you really start to appreciate the power, might and the majesty. Rough Castle is one of the best surviving areas of rampart here, and because it was a turf wall built on a stone foundation, it doesn't have the survival rate that obviously a stone wall like Hadrian's does. But the thing that survives in most places is the ditch, this vast ditch hewn across central Scotland, which even in places where it doesn't survive as a feature you can discern in the landscape, sometimes when you're walking through you can see dips in hedge lines where fence lines sit on the wall these days. One of the unique features of the wall is there's a set of camps running along it which we, and a couple of them have been dated to the 2nd century. The camps are really quite they're quite a special feature of the wall because we've got a range of them that are similar sizes and they're at fairly regular intervals along the wall. And we think they almost certainly would have housed the troops who were involved in the construction of the wall. And most other frontiers can't actually do that with any certainty. So obviously I'm a camp specialist, so I'm going to be biased, but we do actually have a particularly special set of camps here on the Antonine Wall. The next slide is actually showing the Antonine Wall and all the forts in the hinterland, because as I mentioned, as you saw the map with Hadrian's Wall, with all the forts that ran to the south, the Antonine Wall, there's quite a dense occupation of southern Scotland in the 2nd century and quite a network of forts. There's Deer Street going up what is now the modern A68, and then there's various sites running across central Scotland and then into eastern Dumfriesshire. We've got quite a range of sites. And then there's the outpost forts to the north, and in fact they've got forts going up as far north as Perth, basically controlling that flank. So although it's a frontier that's very much about control. It's not just you can't cross here, because there is a crossing point and there is a road that goes up to the north. Continue with the 2nd century, the next slide I was going to show you is the Roman fort at Ardoch, and I don't know if any of you have been there. It's just outside the village of Braco in Perthshire. And that was another one of these early excavations by the Society of Antiquities of Scotland at the very tail end of the 19th century. And we're fortunate that the archive from that is actually in the, we've actually got most of the archive in our other building in John Sinclair House, and quite a lot of images have been scanned. We've got a lovely one of a gentleman basically standing at the base of a rampart, and they've cut through the rampart. And it just goes to show that health and safety in the 19th century was very different to today. The other thing to say about Ardoch is just, it's another one of these sites. The Romans went back to it. It was first built in the 1st century. They went back to it in the 2nd century. There's a succession of camps on the plain to the north, and a couple of them survive as upstanding earthwork features. And again, they're properties in care. And with display boards, and you can visit them. The only thing I would say is it's quite a treacherous walk along the road to get to it, so take care when you visit it. But again, well worth visiting, because it gives you an idea of some of these sites. And when you start walking along some of these camps, you realise the scale of them, and I'll come back to the scale of them later. The next thing I wanted to talk about in relation to Antonine Scotland was the southwest. Where we've got we've got 2 Roman roads running up the main river valleys in southwest Scotland. And we've got Roman roads coming up, both of them coming together up into Lanarkshire, with a network of fortlets going up there. And one of somebody I work with, Matt Simmons, who's a fortlet specialist, his view on fortlets is that they're only ever constructed in areas that are where the Romans are concerned. So one of the interesting aspects of this part of southern Scotland and southwest Scotland is that you have got this dense networks of fortlets. So it suggests it wasn't an area that the Romans felt confident about. They didn't feel confident about it enough to just have a couple of forts and be done with it. So they have got this dense network of fortlets. We've also got quite a number of camps down there, some of which we can date with a certain level of confidence to the 2nd century. So, for example, at Beatock, just a wee bit down from Beatock Summit, where you've got the Evan water flowing through, there was about 15, 20 years ago, there was a study of the paleoenvironmental evidence there and a look at the movement and the creation of river terraces. And it's a site where you've got one camp on one side with these funny gateways that we think relate to the 1st century, and 4 camps, or at least 4 camps on the other side. And that terrace on the other side was only formed in the 2nd century. So we think we have a series of camps there that potentially date to the Antonine period. So in essence, if you've got 4 Antonine camps, that's showing an awful lot of movement and an awful lot of occupation happening in the southwest. Again, reinforcing the notion of the fortlets that, you know, the Romans were keeping a close eye on what was happening in Dumfriesshire. As I mentioned, the Antonine Wall was abandoned. We know Hadrian's Wall was started rebuilding there in the late 150s. So certainly by the early 160s, the Antonine Wall was broadly abandoned, and there was a pulling back. And Hadrian's Wall then became the de facto frontier. And I've mentioned Septimius Severus, who was from what is now modern-day Libya, so he's known as the African Emperor, and he came into Scotland, carried on a litter. He must have been quite a sight. And we've got little pieces of evidence for the 3rd century occupation. As I say, it was potentially quite short because of his premature death in February 210. And one of his sons, Caracalla, lovely chap, murdered his brother so that he could claim the empire for himself. So lovely, lovely family. But we've got the fort at Cramond, of which aspects are visible just outside Cramond Kirk, which you can go and visit. Is one of those sites with 3rd century occupation. And then there's another one that's only known as Cropmarks, which is at Carpoo on the south side of the River Tay. And actually one of the things that's always quite nice about this one is that it's got a stone-built headquarters building. I hope you can see some of the details there. And that's one of the rare occasions where we actually get, in effect, a parching, because most of the sites that we deal with, it's the ditches we see, and in this case it's actually the buildings that we can see. And they're the two main bases that we have. And then we have a whole series of camps which have been located in southern Scotland. It looks like most of it seems to be in the southeast. So we've got more camps coming up Deer Street, in essence in the same place as some of the other ones. And then again going through Angus. And we're told that Severus reached the ends of the earth. Well, he may have reached, what he probably reached is somewhere close to the Montrose Basin and up that way. We don't think he got as far north as Aberdeen. In the 1st century, we believe they got further north. And there have been suggestions that Severus got further north, but the evidence isn't there at present. So we've got a suite of camps, and the interesting thing about both sets of camps is they are by far the biggest camps that you get anywhere in Scotland and indeed anywhere in Britain. And the ones that come up Deer Street, we've got 4 of them now, are 165 to 170 acres in size. So these are vast. And most of them are predominantly known from crop markings, air photographs. So they're buried features that are showing up, where you've got this buried ditch with the growth of crops above it marking something, so you can see that from the air. And we've got one in the borders, called St Leonards, is 170 acres in size. And actually, until relatively recently, it was the largest known camp anywhere in the Roman Empire. I can now say it's the largest known camp in Europe because of the situation in Syria. One of the academics at Leicester has been looking at satellite imagery of Syria and has found some larger ones. They were focusing on terrestrial fieldwork up until that point. Hence the ditch running through a field. It takes about 16 photographs to actually create that map because it's such a vast site. Going back to, so we've got this suite of 4, and also the site of Tremontium, Newstead, near Melrose in the Scottish borders, has got one of these very, very large camps. Again, no dating evidence from it, but the excavations have demonstrated it's the latest feature on that site, which again is helping us to then say, well, that could be Severan. And the fact that they're huge, and the largest army that we ever had campaigning in Scotland. Because you can imagine, Severus was actually up here. He was running the empire from a series of fields in southern Scotland, which is always nice when you're actually standing on them, actually pointing them out to people and saying, you know, the Roman emperor was here. And as I say, at Ardogh, we've got a very large, these are 130 acres, so the ones you get north of the Forth are a little bit larger in size. But this one here is 130 acres, and this area here, as I say, is Black Hill Wood, which is visitable and is a property in care. And this is the latest feature on this site. So again, we don't have anything that says, oh, this is definitely 3rd century in date, but what we do say is it's later than everything else there, and most of the other stuff is 1st or 2nd century. So that's what we use for our dating evidence. What that actually means is we've got a series of sites running up the east coast. So it's the triangles, so there's 4 of them. And then we have a further series running up to here through Perthshire and Angus. And we think that's the movement of Severus and his sons in the early 3rd century. Let's say after his death, his sons abandoned Scotland, and there's a pulling back to Hadrian's Wall, and a lot of rebuilding work then went on, and just an element of outposts, forts and connections heading up through. So that brings me on to the last part of my talk. So this is one of the maps you missed earlier, but you've got it now. And this is the frontiers of the Roman Empire. And as we've mentioned, the Antonine Wall is a World Heritage Site, but you can see the scale of the empire that we're dealing with. And of course, one of the interesting things about studying the Roman army is you've got soldiers moving around. So we've got a huge amount of movement of troops from one end of the empire to the other, and a massive amount of mobility. And they were incredible bureaucrats. So we've got wonderful documentary references and diplomas that, from people's discharge from the army, and places where they wrote things on pieces of pottery and various other things that actually tell us a huge amount. Now, the World Heritage Site, the Antonine Wall was inscribed in 2008, and it joined a World Heritage Site. The Hadrians Wall was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 1987, very early on, because World Heritage Sites only started being inscribed in Britain in 86. And then in 2005, the German Rhaetian Limes joined it, and that's this area here, as part of the same World Heritage Site. And then we joined in 2008. We have ambitions for a wider World Heritage Site, but global diplomacy and bureaucracy being as it is, UNESCO have changed the rules since we set this up, so we're now having to find a new approach. But the process of creating a World Heritage Site is not to be underestimated. It's a mammoth task. David Breeze led it. It takes years. It takes a huge amount of work. You have to get everybody with a vested interest engaged and behind you, and that's everything from the local politicians to the national politicians. I've bought one of these, one of the nomination documents is next door, so you can have a look at it after this talk. And this is the World Heritage Site as it currently stands. Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall, and the Upper German Rhaetian Limes. Needless to say, that is a reconstruction. Their survival is not that good. So this is our World Heritage Site. Now, in terms of actually how we run that in Scotland, the wall runs through 5 local authority areas. And these are East Dumbarton Council, Falkirk, Glasgow City Council, North Lanarkshire and West Dumbartonshire. So we have a steering group that in effect runs all the activities we want to do on the Antonine Wall, which is ourselves and the 5 local authorities. Now, to give you an idea, yes, this is bureaucratic management fun, I think is the best way of putting it. There's us in HES, and we sit on the Antonine Wall steering group with the other 5 local authorities. We have a full-time coordinator who's based here, who works in partnership across them. We have various groups that then report to the steering group, delivering various aspects of the management of a World Heritage Site. The coordinators for the current 3 existing World Heritage Sites sit on the Hexham group, and they discuss the management. We have an intergovernmental committee, because that's how you run World Heritage Sites, which are multinational. They're advised by a specialist research group. They're called the Bratislava group because they were in Bratislava when they first met. Ditto with Hexham, so we have sort of names of places. We obviously report into the Culture and Historic Environment Division of the Scottish Government, but World Heritage is the only aspect of culture that isn't devolved. So we then have a relationship through DCMS, who then outsource their advice to Historic England. So we have a relationship, a very strong relationship, I will say, with Historic England about how this all works. And then they report up to the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, who are advised by ICOMOS, who then also have ICOMOS UK. Clear? But we make it work because we all meet and we all get on and we all have a shared goal. And that's where the management plans are critical, because it actually says this is what we want to do. You get everybody behind you and you do it. And so what does the actual management plan actually mean for us? Well, that's what it looks like. There's a copy next door. In recent years, there's been a lot of effort in terms of footpaths, signage, new interpretation for the wall, new museum displays at the museums that run along the wall and have their collections. We're doing lots of activities for kids. We've got colouring in sheets, and if you really want to spend hours, you can make it look like this. We've been photographing and scanning artefacts from the museums because we're conscious that the site is in one place and the objects are elsewhere in the various museums. And then last autumn, we launched an app where there's still more and more content coming, and you can again find out more information in the leaflets next door. So you can visit the Antonine Wall with an app and actually see some of the museum objects while you're standing on the site. And if you've got a smartphone, it's GPS enabled and it goes ping when you're going over bits of the site. I've done it, it's quite fun. There's other activities going on. Falkirk Council a few years ago got the Ridgeness Slab, which is in the National Museum in Edinburgh, scanned and then use that to painstakingly create a full-scale replica, which is now on display in Bowness, and it's absolutely fantastic display. And we're working with the partners to look at getting funding to do more of these replicas along the line of the wall, and do more accessible information, whether it's in digital form, whether it's, one suggestion that's being taken forward is the idea of Roman-themed play parks, which I'm certainly looking forward to using. But obviously, that's the national context. We've then got the international context. We are managing an international World Heritage Site with numerous partners wanting to join. There's 10 countries across Europe that the Frontier runs through. There is a series of booklets which David Breeze has been masterminding, which are in multiple languages, telling people more about it. And I and my colleague Tricia Weeks, who's the Antonine Wall coordinator, occasionally go off to meetings in Europe. And people always think that, yes, I do go to glamorous locations, and then I sit in rooms that look like this. So it's not as glamorous as it sounds. And one of the things that has delivered right now is we've got funding from Creative Europe to actually deliver enhanced content for these apps. And the app indeed that we've got is an agreement with our colleagues in Bavaria who developed the app first, and they agreed that we could basically use the same platforms. We didn't have to develop the technology from scratch. So we've got a whole series of activities happening over the course of the next year and a half, 2 years, in terms of enhancing the content. And again, there's leaflets on it next door. And sorry, for those of you watching remotely, there's a lot of information online about this, and there will be websites at the end. So as I say, we've got a series of digital models, 3D scans. I always love the idea of a bunch of Roman soldiers standing in the ditch of the Antonine Wall looking at a tablet, but which is 21st century Romans. And then these are aspects of what we're planning on deliver. And as I say, this is the app. So any of you with smartphones, please do download it and please have a play with it. But do remember, we are improving it all the time, and there's content being added. You can get it on the Android and iPhone. And then these are an example of some of the information that we're looking at, some of the things that we're trying to put together. And I'd say at the moment it's a partnership between ourselves and the Germans and the development team who are based in Austria. And we've got various scanning and applications, and indeed there's a Roman game that's going to be going live in the summer called Go Roman. So look out for that if you've got family and friends who are interested in gaming. I must admit, I'm not a gamer. We've got wonderful VR headsets. They make me feel sick, but they are fantastic. I think if you're more imbued in the gaming culture, they are really a fabulous immersive experience. And here are some images from the app. The purple ones are our app, and the orange ones are the German app. So you'll see the similarities by using the benefits of using the same platform, is that we haven't had to develop everything from scratch. We've just piggybacked on German development work. And no doubt there will be other partners wanting to come on board with this at the end of the process. There's a whole series of promotional information that's available, and as I say, and a website. That takes me back to the international cooperation. The World Heritage Site that we want to see runs through, as I say, 10 countries in Europe. We have an international collaboration going to try and achieve the aim of World Heritage Site status for all of these. The Near East and North Africa is a different challenge, so we're focusing on Europe for the time being. And what we have got is some really quite advanced nominations. There'll be a nomination for this part of the Danube, so it comes down to here, that will go in next year with an extension some years later to encompass these countries. This will go in a couple of years' time to be another World Heritage Site under the Front of the Roman Empire umbrella, and then Romania will then follow. And that's what we're currently proposing as our strategy for nominating the Frontiers of the Roman Empire to UNESCO. So you can see, you know, it's a very, very ambitious World Heritage Site. It's going to require an awful lot of cooperation. But actually, I go to these meetings and my colleague goes to these meetings, and there's a huge amount of goodwill. We're all working in the same direction. So that's actually really gratifying when we've got lots of partners with the same goal going in the same direction. And then I thought I'd finish off with some fun. Kirsty mentioned World Heritage Day. This is actually the event we ran in the National Museum last year for World Heritage Day, and this year we did an event a week before World Heritage Day in the Kelvin Grove, because we wanted to have it still in the school holidays. We wanted to tell people about all 6 World Heritage Sites in Scotland, find out more about it. You've got the Antonine Wall stand there. in amongst all the other ones to show how well we actually work together across the World Heritage Sites in Scotland. And then this year, following on from the event we had at the Kelvin Grove, Dig It, which is an initiative run by Archaeology Scotland and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, ran a series of events called Scotland in 6. It had quite good media coverage, but unfortunately we were gazumped by the announcement of a general election on the same day. So we weren't trending as high on Twitter as we'd hoped. But from an Antonine Wall perspective, we had a Romans versus Picts 5K fun run, where the Picts were really quite rude and the Romans were stood very proud. And that was the race as it went. And both Kirsty and I ran it, and I'm pleased to say we both won. Kirsty won Best Dressed Pict and I won Best Dressed Roman, which shows that we take our job very seriously. And then one of the other things that Dig It has done is created a green screen where you can dress up. Obviously, I'm just going to show you the Roman one tonight. You can dress up and have yourself portrayed in the past. So here's one of our colleagues on the reconstruction of the fort at Bar Hill. Here's two who aren't so keen on the Romans, I think it's fair to say. And here's myself and the Bavarian Limes coordinator who was too polite to pretend to be sticking a sword at my throat, even though I was in a tartan dress. So just to say, we do have fun as well. Thank you very much.
Hi, you mentioned that everyone who studied this area was a Romanist. Does that mean there are huge gaps potentially? And if everyone had been a Pictist, would we know lots about Picts?
That was the aerial surveyors in particular. Yes, there's a wonderful reference from a 1930 paper that was written by O.G.S. Crawford, where he was talking about the excitement of his first flight into Scotland. Oh no, maybe his 1939 flight, because in 1930 he flew over Scotland and didn't take a camera with him. And I think it was 8 years until he came back. And it's in that one that he said, you know, there were just so many sites, they were too numerous to record them all. So he focused on the Romans. However, yes, we have benefited from the bias, but the bias has been quite comprehensively attempted to be redressed over the last 20 to 30 years. So although, yes, there has been a strong focus, and when you look at the sortie plots for the flight routes in those early flights, they are very focused on flying the Roman roads. But the very interesting thing was when we started flying off the Roman roads, we then started finding the Roman sites that weren't when we expected them. So, you know, there's this sort of serendipitous thing. But no, about 15, 20 years ago, we massively expanded to start flying in the islands as well, significantly. So I think we have probably tried to fill a lot of the gaps. But the thing with aerial survey is you've got to have the right kind of crop over in a dry summer and have to be flying over it. So, but actually there was a massive growth when aerial survey first took off, probably the wrong phrase, but a massive growth in our understanding, and it has tapered off in terms of the numbers of new sites recorded. What we're finding is we're quite often using different techniques to find out more about known sites and actually finding a little bit more information. But it's all dependent on what the agricultural practices are in a given area. So areas where you've got broadly pastoral conditions, if the site has been ploughed out, you can't necessarily see it, which is where some of the other remote sensing techniques are starting to play a part, because things like LiDAR can detect very, very subtle earthwork features that aren't so clear. And that's airborne LiDAR, that's done from a plane. So although from my research, I always loved the fact that all the early pioneers were Romanists, I think I would say the balance has been redressed. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question.
Gentleman at the front.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned the several camps, suggesting, of course, there's still a fair amount of aggression going on to the north. By this time, there are several large townships in England. So presumably, your suggestion is that England is pacified, or do we know that there are camps as large as the Scottish camps in England?
Well, if you consider that, in effect, Hadrian's Wall was the frontier, and as I say, you had a network of forts below it, then really, I mean, southern England was by and large Romanised, definitely. I mean, you can see where some of the areas where they obviously still had concern, where they had their legionary bases. But no, I would say that that southern England wasn't the issue by the time you're into the 3rd century, not at all. But I think what Severus actually wanted to do was not have a wall running across Scotland to just conquer the whole island. He couldn't see why we didn't just conquer the whole thing. But the other thing with the Severian campaigns is we've got some literary sources for them, but you have to take them with a pinch of salt, because some of the stuff that he says, that Cassius Dio, who's our literary source, is laughable, I think, in terms of the evidence. So, but the fact that they refer to the numbers of Iron Age peoples in Scotland who were killed, it's probably exaggerated, but again, it's an indication of the mindset. And actually, when you read biographies of Severus, he was quite a austere and quite ferocious man, and not to be messed with. So I think that that's one of the reasons why he had very, very strong ambitions. But yes, I mean the north of England and Scotland was always the military zone. So the south was by and large broadly peaceful. Once they'd got over the Iceni trouble of the Boudiccan revolt in the mid-1st century, we get very little evidence for trouble until you start getting much later on and you get continental raiders. So.
Given the sort of quite dramatic ebb and flow of the frontier over the time periods, and some of it's quite a long time, how did the Romans record where these camps were in order to find them again, perhaps decades later? And they might have burned them as well, so overgrown and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, they must have had, I mean, I think I would use the phrase itineraries rather than maps, because we do have one or two itineraries that survive, which give place names, but they must have had really quite detailed geographical descriptions. I mean, some of them will be very easy to find again. So the site of Newstead, as I say, outside Melrose, it's just by the three hills, which are a very significant feature in the landscape. So some of them are quite straightforward to find. But yes, they must have had very good, as I say, I mean, we know from what has survived that they had very strong records. They were very bureaucratic. So the idea that they would have had, I don't think it would be something that we would currently then say is obviously a map, but they would have had something, some form of geographical descriptor that enabled them to come back to these sites, as I say, long after the sites have been last occupied.
I was just wondering, what was the population of the Antonine Wall?
Oh, $1 million question. Can't answer that. In terms of the Iron Age people or the number of soldiers on the wall, I don't think we've got anything like enough evidence to be able to answer that question. I can't think of.
Well, was it quite sparse, the population?
Well, we've got quite a number of sites which would have had, where we've got quite a lot of roundhouses together, but unless you excavate them, you can't tell how contemporary they are. So we've got, I mean, like in northeast Fife is littered with what we see as probably later Iron Age settlement. But how contemporary it all is with one another, and whether we're actually seeing what looks to us like in effect an Iron Age village, or whether we're actually talking about settlements that moved, is difficult to tell. We've obviously got we've got a handful of sites where you've got quite a lot of occupation together.
If you're building a wall across the country, and if it was hardly anybody above the wall, why bother?
Well, I think, no, I mean, there were plenty of people to the north of the wall, because obviously we've got, I mean, when you start getting further north, you have got plenty of evidence for Iron Age, but the volume, I can't tell you. I mean, obviously when you start getting out to the north and west, where the survival is very, very good, you've got a huge number of Iron Age sites. So we know that there's, populations and communities. But actually, once you're into the lowland areas, the areas where the Romans got, that's actually harder. And one of the things that's always vexed us with regards to the Antonine Wall is because although geographically it's a logical place to put it, because you think that Hadrian's Wall runs between the Tyne and the Solway, and it's roughly 80 miles long, whereas the Antonine Wall is 40 miles long, so it's half the length running between the Forth and the Clyde. And you stand in bits of it and you look out to the Campsie Fells. Well, it's quite possible that the Campsie Fells had communities living on them, but we haven't detected them yet. And I mean, I think it's largely because we probably haven't applied the right techniques, and as techniques are developing, then we might sort of see more of that. But there are aspects where people are quite regularly saying, well, what's it doing here? Why have we got it here? Other than the fact that you've got an isthmus to put it. So sorry, I can't really answer the question in terms of how many there were and where there were, but there have been projects. The Roman Gask project has been trying to look specifically at the Roman Iron Age interaction, having some successes there in terms of determining, but then trying to determine that something's contemporary with an occupation that's only 20 years long. It's very difficult. So, yeah.
Gentleman at the back, I think you had a question.
I was going to ask about the expansions or platforms on the Antonine Wall. Particularly, there's two on Croy Hill. Basically, what are they for? And if you don't know, have you got any plans to do a big study?
We have actually got a collaborative PhD student between Historic Environment Scotland and Canterbury University at the moment who's looking at the LiDAR data for the wall. And obviously I think he's only in his second year, so we've still got some way to go. Because we collected LiDAR data for the whole wall as part of the Scottish 10 project, and I think if there are any other ones that survive in any form of likely form that could be detected through that, then he will identify them. They, as you probably know, they tend to occur in pairs. The idea that they're used for some form of signalling, transverse signalling across the wall, is still the best explanation that most people have, particularly as one or two of them are actually sited in very good places to actually view down to the nearby fort and then enable that cross signage. But one of the other options is that actually may have been to do with the construction of the wall when they were first building it. They may have been critical in that early stage of building it, but at the moment we don't know. And we'll see, as I say, if the work of the LiDAR PhD student actually produces anything that actually helps us. But I mean, if you think that at least one of them has been, well, one of the enclosures has been excavated and we're still none the wiser. So we wouldn't necessarily argue that the excavation is the natural recourse. Yeah, they're still debated, I think it's fair to say.
About recreating. If somebody thinks there were signal stations,
Oh, there's been lots of modelling with.
stand on them with a signal.
Yeah, no, there's been lots of that side of things, which is why we know that the visibility in some areas is good. But in other, I mean, I think one of them, I can't remember which one it is. You kind of stand on it and go, why here? Whereas one of the other ones, you stand on it, clearly I can see why here, because I can see where I can see in both directions, and I can see to that fort and that fort. So, sorry, can't answer that question with a confident answer.
Right, one last question, quick one from the man in the green at the back.
Security considerations aside, can you tell us why the Romans actually wanted to capture Britain at all?
Wow, I'm going to need a glass of wine to answer that question.
And having got the southern half of the island, what on earth did they want with the northern half? Once they discovered what was there, it's not very productive. It was very little benefit to them.
I think I'll start by giving you my Magnus Magnusson answer, which is I've started, so I'll finish. I think that's a part of it. I mean, the other thing is, if you think about it, once the decision had been taken to come into Britain, you either lose face and retreat. I mean, bear in mind, Britain did have quite a lot of mineral resources.
Caesar came and left. He found it.
Yeah, but there was a political thing going on there. Britain wasn't what he was after. I think. Yeah, we'll not get political. No, I think. But there were. I mean, you know, there are the gold mines in South Wales. There are. Some minerals that would have been done, but you could argue, obviously, with Northern Britain, that there was less of the economic benefit than they got from other countries. But conversely, once you're holding a country, once you're holding an area, you have to hold it, and that means putting troops in. And so, in theory, if you'd conquered the whole of Britain, if you think they conquered the whole of Spain, and they had one legion in Spain. In Britain, you generally had a minimum of 3 legions, plus a whole raft of auxiliaries. It's expensive to hold. But do you want to be the emperor that loses face? Probably not. But as I say, there was the mineral resources. And by that stage, I mean, by the time you get, you know, only a generation or so in, you've got a Romanized community there who see themselves as being part of the Roman Empire. They are part of that. They don't want you to pull out either. But the north is a whole different ballgame.